Hi guys. What's up?
Is it morning?
There's a lot of you.
How's everyone's PAX? Is it good? General mumbler.
Thank you for coming to the panel, which is us talking about world building, which we feel we know a lot of. We do, probably.
We do. We absolutely.
Confidence.
World experts.
Like, we know all the things.
Yeah. Ask us a question, we can probably answer it. Anything, including calculus. Alright, let's do some introductions, people. This is me. My name is Abby Howard. I do the webcomics Last Halloween and Junior Scientist Power Hour. Bye. Take a look. I was also on Penny Arcade show Strip Search.
My name is Lexxy Douglass. I work on the webcomic Cloud Factory. I was a freelance illustrator for 3 years, and I currently work at Motiga, which is an independent video game studio here in Bellevue, and we make the game Gigantic.
My name is Claire Hummel. I worked at Microsoft Games for the past 5 years or so, working on Xbox titles, including such boring titles as Connectimals, and more exciting ones like Sunset Overdrive and Fable Legends, things like that. I also got to do freelance for Irrational on Bioshock Infinite, designing the Lutece twins and young Elizabeth, which was really fun. And now I'm at HBO as a production designer at a new office they opened up in Seattle. And I watched Strip Search.
My name is Falcone. I was also on Strip Search, and also watched Strip Search, so you know, that's about.
I did.
I'm a comic artist. I did Cardigan Weather and Quick Fresh, my new comic, and then I'm also a mobile UI UX designer with a technology incubator here in Seattle, so very prestigious.
So, to start off the panel, we would like to talk about how important it is to do your research. Now, some of you might be saying to yourselves, I don't need to do research, I'm making up this world, it's whatever I want it to be. But you see, perhaps your world's not going to be as fantastical and fun if you don't really know what we already have in our world. Let us start by talking about animals, because I'm here. Oh, wait, environment. Never mind. Anyway, think about...
That's the weirdest dog I've ever seen.
There's an animal somewhere in it. Anyway, look at weird stuff you find on the internet. Look at the outside world.
So I'm going to speak to this, like in terms of designing environments and stuff. One thing I love me in my video games, but so often with natural environments, there's a focus, and world building in general, there's this focus to make things look cool rather than making them look like plausible and engaging and stuff. And so like you have concept art where it's like everything has arches and weird spiky mountains regardless of geology or anything. And so I think it's important to actually like see what trees go with what rocks. How are you defining how much water source there is in the area you're defining, that sort of thing. Like it just makes it so much more engaging, and then when you choose to break those rules, it will make sense. You'll have a purpose for doing it rather than just cramming and being like, oh, I like these trees and this arch. And then you get some weird, horrible stuff. So don't do that.
There is a way that the world is set up already, and if you don't really know what that is, then setting up your own world can sometimes just look like a big mishmash of whatever. And hey, some people go for that. Look at this thing.
I like to go by the same rules you would go to if you were, thinking about stylizing artwork. Like the rule is, you want to know what the basic parameters are. You want to know what the box is that the world operates in, and then once you know that box, then you can break out of it, and that's when you'll be creating the most that's when you get these like really luscious scenes or these these beautiful designs because you are purposefully breaking the rules.
And happy unique accidents. I think having those parameters, that box to bounce around in, like it's amazing how that kind of breaks you out of habits. It gives you kind of chances to make things that look unique and untouched, and like everyone knows what a tree looks like or what a horse looks like. They look a lot weirder than you think they are if you actually do the research for it.
Especially horses.
Horses are so weird.
No one likes drawing horses, and if you do, you're special. I mean, I guess elementary school girls.
Yes.
If you don't like dragons, you like horses, or you like both, and that's okay too. It takes all kinds.
Dragon horses are the best.
Horse dragons are even better.
Speaking of creature design, so learn anatomy. That is the most important thing that I think there is. Look, I did this. Anyway, learning the anatomy of what you're drawing just makes it look so much better. It doesn't matter if it looks more plausible, but it will. It does matter, sorry, because people will look at it and think, you know, I see where this goes together. I see how this actually exists. For instance, I'm sorry Claire, I'm using you as an example because she drew this when she was much younger, the first image up there, and did not really listen to anatomy, and it shows because
I thought I did. I drew a skull, so clearly I knew what was up.
Oh yes, a very plausible skull that totally wouldn't work.
No.
Anyway.
Don't even try to excuse it.
So, you know, once she had learned proper anatomy, the bottom image looks like a new creature. It looks amazing and fun, and it engages the viewer instead of confusing the viewer and making you think too hard. Because the thing about people is we absorb this stuff anyway. Recreating it is what's difficult. So if you absorb all of it, then there. And what I was saying is the viewer absorbs it and then doesn't make sense of it.
I'd like to note that art is 5 years old, so please do not try to based on it.
And in doing this and making your creatures more believable, and really it goes for environments, cultures and things like that, and making this more believable, it increases the immersion of your story experience, whether it's a video game or a comic or a movie or an animated short. It really takes the viewer into your world, and when stuff doesn't really look like it makes sense, even if it looks interesting, like visually cool, it's going to take them out of the story. And it's doing this research and making things fit together in a believable way really helps with that a lot.
To just like give an example, and whether it's very polarizing, but you guys remember when James Cameron's Avatar came out? Like, I actually witnessed someone like weeping when they came out of the theater because Pandora wasn't real. And it's like, whether you like it or not, the level of thought that goes into building something like that, where the characters, the environment, everything, and the writing is all based in these world-building elements, you give your readers or your viewers or whoever your audience is a much richer experience. And so you're benefiting you because your work's going to be better, but also.
Yeah, to that point and to Abby's point, I think the thing about great world building is that it's really subtle, is that people don't necessarily pick up on it. It's like the same with a lot of good design, is that it just kind of plays in the background and people appreciate it. People aren't necessarily playing through the original BioShock and picking apart like the door jams, but because they're beautifully designed, it just adds to that cohesivity and the feeling of being immersed in an environment in a way that people coming out of Avatar sobbing seem to feel.
It was beautiful. We should have done
Also, an important thing about immersion is making your creatures look cohesive, which I think is important for stuff like evolution. Do I have? Anyway.
Why did the Navi only have 4 arms when every other animal on that planet had 6?
Do you know where in the evolutionary tree a hexapodal organism would have had to evolve? Fish. Sarcopterygia have 6 limb things that could have evolved into 6 limbs for some reason, but instead, we came out of it, tetrapods, we have 4. Some people say stuff like, oh man, like my bird has arms, so it has 4 limbs instead of 2, and I'm like, birds have 4 limbs. Do you know what a wing is? It is a limb. Anyway, the bad one before was to show that fingers, they are fingers. They're not just weird sticks on the back. So don't think of your organisms like, this organism is totally independent of this other one. Instead, think of, let's see how all of these organisms can kind of fit together in the same world, how they would be related, and you don't have to think through all of that, though sometimes it can be fun if you're into it, just saying. But you do have to keep it in mind. For instance, James Cameron, the same example, Avatar, we were talking about, they look just like people. They didn't look anything like the rest of the animals in the world. Whereas we look at, say, chimpanzees, and we're like, that looks like a man. This is weird. So that's good world building. Good job, Earth. You did it.
Good job, Earth.
Look at these ones, but you haven't seen
God
animals look like that.
world builder.
How dare you again? And I think it's very important to do your research so you'll find weird stuff that lives. Did you know that anteaters don't have a moving jaw? They just have a solidified skull. it's evolved that way, so it's not weird. Really.
I mean, it is, but...
It is weird, but it makes sense. Anyway, also, this weird deep-sea worm. Deep-sea worms are the best, especially for monsters. Deep-sea worms, look at them.
Yeah,
see,
that's part
weird
of
stuff.
Doing the research is that, you know, you think... God damn it.
They have jaws made of iron.
Sorry.
That's not better. Sorry.
When you do your research, you're thinking, you know, oh, everything on Earth is so boring. I'm so used to seeing it all the time. There's some really weird stuff, and it can give you ideas that you never would have had before. So it's, you know, or nightmares.
Indeed.
Many, many sleepless nights.
Which could work for your world if it's spooky. You know, hey, whatever, you're jealous. Anyway, here we have...
I wanted to say that one thing that I know that I struggle with, that maybe some of you are struggling with in your own words, is that just because something exists in nature or whatever, it doesn't mean that you can't borrow from it. Like, you don't need to go up to an elephant and be like, sorry man, I plagiarized and you have toes. It's fine.
Give you credit.
The different, in the art world, that's known as appropriation, and it is one of our greatest tools. So really think of, you know, like think of all these, especially now with the internet and Wikipedia, like you have no excuse for not being able to go and look up weird images of worms or whatever. So it's just like, think of that like, this is your resource. You have all of the things that exist, everything. You have everything as this resource, and it's silly not to use it and to think that it's somehow cheating to be using this.
Yeah, I think one good way to internalize that kind of stuff is to make sure that when you're drawing reference and from these resources that you are internalizing it in some way. So not all world building people are artists, but I speak from the perspective, from a panel of artists. But actually sitting down and doing sketches and getting those shape language and that anatomy into your brain over and over again. So rather than you find this one cool image of an elephant and you like take exactly half of it and stick it on one of your aliens, instead you just kind of start to understand the subtleties of that animal, of the environment, of the architecture you're drawing from. Because you don't want people to, this happens all the time where you're watching a movie or playing a game, be like, I know the exact painter you're looking at, or I know the exact animal that you saw an article on Boing Boing about that I read too. And there's just like no level of filtration there. So making sure that you take that and you just consume it and crush it down into inspiration, and then find a way to spit it out the other side, and yes, steal from nature as much as you can.
In that same regard, it's important to know sometimes how or why certain things would happen in an animal, like why certain things would evolve, such as a trunk. So instead of saying like, man, I'm gonna stick a trunk in the same, like this weird area, maybe think why the trunk is there to begin with, and that's like something you would go off of. So,
It's all about
Question
thinking about
everything.
Yeah, exactly. You should question why. What do they want? What do they need? What is this organism? What is this environment? Like, what are all the needs? And you're fulfilling those by putting trunks in where it is.
Yeah,
So
functional
actually-
design is really fun, like getting away from aesthetics, but actually like figuring out like, oh, because of this world I've designed that's based on, you know, geothermal energy, like suddenly the power sources would have to look like this, the architecture would have to look like this, and adapting it just turns out so much better.
and that way you can like come up with the environment first, which doesn't always have to be the case, and then you can kind of be like, well, what kind of animals would live here? How would the local population use these animals, and that kind of stuff. And that is why it's important to look at all the animals in the world, and also all the architecture and everything.
And plants. Plants too, very important.
Who cares about plants? Botanists.
One of my favorite examples of this, and I talk about it on every panel I'm on, but is the sequel to Mist Riven. There is this creature, there's this creature in it called a wark, which was idolized by the native Rivenese, but then taken by this horrible tyrant and turned into this meat-eating creature that they feared. And throughout the game, really subtly, you will see little like iconography of the wark that have like fruit placed in front of it. You have like petroglyphs of the wark. You have little kids games where you learn how to count by how many times a little like wooden man is lowered into the wark's mouth. Like it's really subtle, and it just integrates the relationship with this animal into the culture in a really cool way. So, go play it on Steam. So I included some animal references well. Not as much as Abby, because she has so much animal reference, but it's a really cool dead whale carcass. It's cool to look at rotting things as reference for animals, because sometimes you want your aliens to look like dead whale carcasses. Or fetal bats, which are some of the coolest things I've ever seen.
Fetal organisms in general are really cool, especially vertebrates, because we all kind of look the same, and it looks really cool, and then we kind of like get further deviations. Yeah, weird, we get all specialized. All right. And here are some of my favorite weird animal or fungi things. Tardigrades, of course, which live in space. So see, there are so many things. Yes, they live, I mean, they don't live in space, but they could live in space because they can dehydrate and that kind of stuff. So using elements from animals that you find can be so cool for your world. You can be like, well, what if I have an organism that can live in space? What if people can use this organism to transport in space? And also, this is a photosynthetic animal, which has incorporated chloroplasts from plants into itself so that it can actually photosynthesize.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
This is what you learn in science school. I didn't graduate, but hey, I know a lot about animals. And this is a fungi, of course you guys all know this, made famous by Last of Us, which, hey, would have just been a really boring zombie game had it not had this one special element that it incorporated from Mother Nature, is the fungi that, of course, goes into the brain of animals such as insects, arthropods, other things like that, and just kind of takes control, makes them sometimes crawl up a plant so that it's high up so the spores can travel, and just like breaks out of the skull and grows up, and it looks super cool. Watch nature documentaries, it's super fun, you learn all kinds of stuff to use in your world.
And it's neat to think about the cross-pollination of that kind of reference. Like, I could totally see using that for costumes or for architecture, all sorts of things, like just the shapes that nature makes accidental.
That actually reminds me, where's the wettest place on earth? There was a beautiful set of photography that came out. And they use these trees, they weave their roots into living bridges, and they last for hundreds of years. And that kind of weird spindly texture could be used in very similar, like, what if you increase the scale of an organism like that by like 100% or 1,000% or 10,000%, and what that would look like in a world like, what is it, Nausicaa, where you have the miasma, which has all these gigantic fungal organisms. So really cool stuff.
How did you say it?
Nausicaa?
Or miasma.
Oh, miasma? Yeah, is it miasma? Nausicaa?
Do you mean Nausicaa?
Sorry, I don't believe
Valley Boys.
Oh, wait, I really love the show. I love
But is she in Japanese?
Sorry, I did not do my research.
Anyway, so check out this guy.
There are these skeletons. I think it was actually Catholicism that used it. I'm not sure.
Like costuming
Like
and stuff now in
Catholicism.
cultures.
Yes, costuming and cultures.
Leaving animals behind, kind of.
Not quite as much as
They'll probably come up again because
I'll
we
still
like
talk
them.
about it. But these are like cultures which took what they believed to be the skeletons of saints and dressed them up in gold and jewels and armor and all this kind of stuff. It's really cool. So see. Sorry. No, I wasn't gonna make a point. I was gonna be like, see, it's cool.
It is cool. So there's a book called The Empire of Death, which is fantastic, and it collects all of this stuff. And he did like 2 more books. There's a ton to collect on saints that have just been turned into like God knows how many things. But in terms of cultural practices, like doing that research, I know you were talking about researching spell languages and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely, and just cultural traditions that inform the way that people do things in day-to-day life. Some of the examples that I was talking about with the ladies earlier was like my enchanting and spellcasting systems that I use in the Cloud Factory, and how in the main area of the world that the story takes place, they use what is more or less like your standard kind of, there's an incantation, it's transcribed in books and spells, you read from that, you recite it, and you cast the spell. Whereas where the twins come from, which if you don't know what my comics about, then this won't make very much sense to you, but there are 2 other characters whose family come from another region of the world, and their means of casting is song-based, and so their spells are cast by singing and playing instruments. And it's, you know, the same result with a completely different practice. And, you know, taking into consideration how a culture might inform that kind of thing is something that adds another level of depth to your world.
I think that, especially with these saints examples, like we have a whole human tradition and history of like these weird practices that made perfect sense at the time, but now when you recontextualize them, you can do it, like, where this is like a thing of like honor, or say if you were taking it to some kind of like sci-fi futuristic thing, where you take this same practice, but, you make it your own. You can put a completely different mood on it, where it's like, oh my god, why are they dressing up these bodies? That's really scary. Or, oh, that's so nice, they give them a burial, whatever. It's like, you can take these things and you can like make them your own, and you can you can warp them once you learn about them.
Yeah. Once it's another case of learning the rules, learning how things are, and then breaking them, bending them to your will. With your iron artist fists with carpal tunnel.
Just further examples of research, basically just kind of like looking at other cultures can be important. Make sure you do not just steal other cultures, because that is called cultural appropriation.
Yeah, that's actual appropriation.
That is not just animal appropriation, because animals don't care. Cultures, it's bad because then we like put them on a pedestal, or we like degrade them somehow, and don't do that. Or it's just like making them into a costume rather than an actual entire culture.
And with regards to that, if you are going to integrate more things like that, make sure you do your research extensively. That's got to be like super duper heavy duty research, talking to experts perhaps, making sure that what you're doing is not horribly offensive.
It's very easy to become racist instead of like looking at another culture. You're just like making fun of another culture and don't really know it.
Yeah.
My go-to bad example that I brought up earlier today is that Padme Amidala in episode 1, I always thought the costume designs in that film are beautiful if weird in context. And then some 20 years, oh god, it's not that long ago. A lot of years later, suddenly looking at Mongolian ceremonial dress and realizing like, oh, they just one-to-one aped it. And so they took a non-white culture and they were like, this looks alien, let's put it on a white lady and call it a day. Which is essentially the worst you can possibly do. Like suddenly putting white people in the situation and exotifying the other. It's like, these are bad things to do while world building. So tread lightly, talk to people who know better than you. If you make mistakes, own up to it, become a better person. Don't just get all defensive.
Yeah, don't defend it.
Yeah.
Accept that other people may be right, and you should listen to them, because defending it just makes you a worse person. Also, if you're looking at something and you say, well, I'm going to defend this horribly sexist, misogynist, racist, whatever thing in this other person's world, do not do that. Instead, question. Be like, wait a minute, they didn't have to do that. Remember, people are making these. It is not something that actually exists. It is something that you need to look at critically sometimes. Doesn't mean you don't have to hate, you can still like the thing while also being critical of the thing. Criticism is great, question everything.
Yeah, the number of people.
Question everything, guys.
Question everything. The number of people who defend, I'm a big fan of history. I like history. The number of people who defend sexism and racism in historical games, even though they have no idea what they're talking about, is remarkable. It's just people just come, they're like, well, that's just the way it was. It's like, well, no, not exactly. There's some subtlety there. It's like, there are women and people of color who have had amazing narratives throughout history, and they just haven't been told. And the idea is like, well, we have to assume it was the worst for everyone except a white guy.
Because you know what? White guys have been telling history for a long time. White guys have been omitting things from history for a long time. Perhaps see history as a narrative in itself that should also be critiqued. For instance...
And you can still like it.
You can still like it.
Just question it.
Yep. Medieval POC is a Tumblr that is currently being attacked constantly all the time because it's just pictures of art from actual olden day times. It ranges from medieval to wherever, really. It's basically just, hey, look, black people, Italian people, Asian people, African, everybody. Everybody has been around. Ships have been a thing. People could travel. Guess what? It's not all white guys all the time.
Europe isn't like a weird island away from everything else. That's what surprised me, is people are like, well, Africa's so far away.
And they were all like, they didn't have any culture and they were all killing each other all the time. Guess what? Maybe not. Maybe they weren't. Maybe it's just because that's what white people thought they did when they moved there, because white people are horrible. Sorry guys, we're horrible.
Hey, it's because white people killed everyone, so they assumed that's what it was.
Okay. Hey, how
Oh.
World building history.
Can you tell that this is really important to us?
Through this panel, you can make your own. You can build your own world, and whatever could be, everyone could be nice to each other.
Gay people could be okay. It couldn't just be like, well, that person's gay, but let's not talk about it. Instead, it could be like, yeah, I'm dating a boy and I'm a boy, or a non-gendered person. That can happen. Don't put misogyny on all this dumb stuff in your world. It doesn't have to be kings and queens. It can be like a patriarchal, matriarchal society of both. I don't know, dude.
Costumes.
Think about it.
Oh, wow. We have like a whole section on this. I don't want to cut into your question, everything.
Don't worry. I think we were still in the other section and I skipped ahead.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to bring up how cool I think the crocodile armor up in the upper left is. It's from the Roman era. There was an Egyptian cult that wore crocodile armor, which is extremely cool. And then Napoleon's it's called Egyptian style, which is nonsense, but his gorgeous cloak in the lower right is really beautiful and just looks like straight out of a fantasy movie. So.
And again, nature, culture, all good things that you can find and research and turn into other good things that you make up.
I know that Pinterest gets a really bad rap because if you go to the main page, it's a bunch of weird inspiration and cake recipes that no one's ever going to act on. But if you dig deeper, if you find the right people to follow, like I use it, I have obsessive boards for researching fashion and armor and architecture, and it's just such a great place to aggregate it. And there are other people, you'll find people who are working at museums who have Pinterest, and you can just dive deep and waste hours upon hours of your time researching. Researching. Yeah.
That's billable time.
And also modern fashion is awesome inspiration for shape language. It took me a long time to get into actual runway fashion, shame on me. But then realizing that it's treating the body as a canvas, and it's such great, especially like if you're designing sci-fi worlds, looking at Alexander McQueen and all these other modern designers. Yeah, it's great. Yeah. They're the best.
Aha, body shapes. Just kind of in general.
They are many and varied.
Yes. Guess what? It is not all skinny white people or muscular white people, and only one kind of skinny and only one kind of muscular, because there are multiple kinds. Guess what? Everybody's shape is different. I highly recommend you look up, there's a book, I believe, of a bunch of pictures of Olympian athletes. These are all athletic bodies. These are Olympians.
I
So
think the book is called Athlete, if I'm not mistaken. It's
deep.
out of print, but if you can, there's scans online. Sorry, author guy. But you can still get copies on Amazon and stuff, and it is amazing reference, because no matter how much you think you understand the limits of the human body, especially the fit human body, it's so cool to see the variety and the different types of fitness and how you can, like, it's the most perfect character lineup. It's amazing.
if you have characters, think about what they do and why they would be shaped that way. For instance, Frozen. A chick is locked in a room for a really long time, and yet she's still a very skinny, very fit woman. I mean, that's not
She ran like heck of miles.
Why was she not out of
She
breath?
lost it all then.
Nothing. Like when she runs out in the
Like, was she in there just like doing jumping jack reps like the whole time?
Oh, yeah, she
That's what we didn't see. We didn't see the training montage.
She was doing P90X lean.
Anyway, that is not to say that somebody locked in a room for like 90 years or whatever could not just be that way, because sometimes that is the way a body naturally is. But maybe think that sometimes that is not the way a body naturally is as well, and that it would be okay if they weren't. That's another thing.
You can do this in two different ways. You can take a character and say, okay, they are doing this. How does that inform the way they look? Or you can be like, I want a character to look this way. What's the explanation I can give for that? And it's totally cyclical. It can totally inform your choices either way that way, which is pretty
Same
cool.
with if you're making your animals or your creatures
Yeah.
or whatever. Like you have a really sluggish like dog character, and the dog might be
A trouble.
he might not be super healthy. So
In terms of Frozen, I almost feel like I just want to see a difference. If you have this one really active who shoves her face with chocolate all the time, she's just gonna look different from her wasting away sister.
if that's real, I can just stay in my room, play video games, or watch Frozen.
Further body diversity, drawn by our friend Lexxy. Yes, see?
Inspired by the Olympic lineup.
Mm-hmm. See? Art is inspired by life. And here is one by Amy.
Yeah, I'm really big on different silhouettes. Like I mean, obviously not. I don't sound like the best example anyone's ever done, but it's like I'm constantly looking for looking at. I like go to places and watch people walk by and be like, Miyazaki did it, so it's okay. It's not stalking. It's research. So sometimes I'll go and I'll watch actual people and I'll see people that have an interesting shape that sparks my creativity. And I think that's a really great silhouette. I would have never thought of that on my own because I only,
I do that too.
You only have
a
yourself
sketchbook
a
full
reference.
of people that didn't know I was looking at them.
Yeah, no, you have to.
Sorry.
Okay.
Throughout high school, you draw people who look like you until you realize.
No, it's my original character. Her name is Shmamy.
Or in my case,
Yes,
you draw
so.
the people that you see in other people's movies and books and things. I did not draw people who looked like me because I thought nobody should look like me because they didn't. In culture, question everything.
Oh, no.
Oh, God.
We're gonna get in so much trouble.
More body diversity among the furry community.
Oh yeah, these were for a game called Gunpowder that turned out looking nothing like this. But I love Westerns and I love American animals. And so it was really fun to kind of take different archetypes in Westerns and see how you could translate them through animal species. And also the only lady character they had was a frog prostitute who was literally traced off of Rango concept art. So it's not a good move, so screw them. And so I was like, hey, how about an Annie Oakley white-tailed deer? And so even though I didn't get into the game, it was just a fun chance to play around with stylized body types. We do a lot of realistic white guys at Microsoft, and so the chance to kind of, any chance I get to break out of that is pretty fun.
Wait, not yet.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, that's in 10 minutes. We still have time to talk about question everything, which is my favorite.
Yes.
Yeah, we've been absorbing culture for a really long time. We've been absorbing the things that we are shown. Movies, books, video games, especially with video games because you get the same character every single time. And this isn't a thing about character design, but it's just that...
They're part of your world.
Yeah, it is.
They fit in there eventually.
Especially since the you are seeing the world through the eyes of these characters. So if it's like a white male character with a grizzled face, that is not a standard for everyone. And I mean, it's a very important topic, but kind of off topic, I guess. But still, also think about the position your character has in the society and the world to kind of, it flavors the way that the viewer sees the world. So you might be, say, in Watership Down, you're a rabbit. So humans are like these giant lumbering monsters that kill you all the time. They are monsters. Meanwhile, if it was from a person's perspective, it would be like, oh man, all these dang rabbits in my garden, I'm gonna go shoot them up. And you're like, yeah, go shoot them. They're eating your carrots and lettuce and stuff. They're bad. Or a
They'll
dog.
just make more of themselves, it's fine.
Yep. Or a dog might see it as like, oh man, like I hate the rabbits too because my master hates the rabbits and because they're fun to eat and my master's the best. Humans are so great, they're so fun to us.
That's so true.
I think in that regard, it's also important to remember that generally, if you're planning on marketing your world building to people and you aren't just releasing a book of world building, it's important to consider the narrative that you are actually following throughout this world because it helps you prioritize what to actually focus on while you're designing. I got chewed out in the best way possible by Sam Bosma last week in Iceland, which sounds so cool, where I talked about how much I enjoy just designing random props and just finding corners of the worlds that I work on in my free time and just being like, I need to design a saddle, I'm going to design a saddle. And he kind of steered me back towards, well, consider who is your protagonist, what's the general thread of this story, and to build out from there, to like build the structure, but then focus in, and what is prioritized for this character? I love the idea of like, how does the narrative cast the emotional tone of these things? Like, would Harry Potter be as pro-Gryffindor if it wasn't through Harry Potter's eyes? That sort of thing. Like, that is really cool to think you can actually change shape language and color language based on whose story you are telling within the same world.
I also want to say that there's a balance between being Tolkien and writing the Silmarillion, which is the greatest, but is basically just a reference to all of his world building that he did that was like got compiled. And what is a sustainable amount of world building to take on for whatever your project happens to be. So, if you're making a short and you are short something and you you can only do so much world building. You can't think like, well, how was this universe created? Right? What does their dirt smell like? Think about, focus in, think about what's important, and think about what is doable for you or your team or who's ever responsible for this world building.
Absolutely. I think a lot of us, we are all geeks. We tend to be perfectionists. We tend to want to dig down as deep as we can, but you just get caught in these cycles where you can't break out of, where you're making no actual progress in your project because you're like, well, would they have this type of screw in this metal? Would they have this type of metal? And it's like, no. Just design the cart and then figure out the screws when you're 80 or something and you're writing your own somewhere.
And I know it sounds like we're saying, like hyper-focus, like, we really need to hone in on these specific details, but when really you need to keep it loose. You need to let some things go and focus on the important things. Focus on the stuff that's relevant to your story. Maybe develop it a little bit outside of those parameters, for your own reference or for possible reference down the line. But keeping it loose and giving yourself parameters to work with, which we did talk about a little bit earlier, kind of having that box that informs what you do. Giving yourself parameters and nailing down the important stuff while giving yourself room to grow, giving yourself and your story and whatever is in it room to grow. Just you'll be able to create a world that feels more organic. You won't feel boxed in. You won't have weird continuity issues that you run into later because you were so hardcore about nailing everything down right away at the beginning, and then things change as you work on it.
It's not a thing that you get good at right away. If you're here right now, you're probably passionate about world building or you're interested in world building, and that's awesome, and you're all like, we're all taking these steps that lead us in a life where we'll probably be passionate about world building later, and we'll probably be better world builders later. So it's like, we're all on the same journey to be making better worlds and doing a better job and like learning from each other, and we're all like part of the same context, and we're all part of the same world, guys.
One tree, many leaves.
Yeah, one tree, many leaves. But it's not a race. It is you're absorbing things from this project that you get to use in like 7 projects down the line. You're like, I never thought that leaf that I thought was cool and like had my phone background for 2 years would come in handy, but oh my god, it's gonna break the case.
That happens all the time. Like it's so true. Like you just have these stores of reference, and I have these books where just as an artist, I feel like you hear all the time, like, clear out your bookshelf. It's good to clear out your bookshelf. But as an artist, it's like those books are there. Guillermo del Toro talks about having shit tons of books just because you never know when you are going to need that specific book. And I've had so many times, like we were at work and we were talking about how to design like infographic trees within a medieval context. I was like, oh my god, I just got a book on the history of trees and infographics from like the 1400s onward. And I never thought I would get to use it. Or like this book on boogie architecture that I had had for 5 years, and then suddenly a project came up at Microsoft and it was exactly what we needed. Like it's that compilation or that combination of knowledge just slowly building up, and you're following it away.
I designed something I was working on. I used to live in Connecticut on the East Coast, and if you're not familiar with the East Coast, we have things called hurricanes. They're horrible. They're just the worst. So I knew that for maybe like 2 weeks out of the year, I was not going to have power, which means I was not going to have internet. And for a young creative child, that was horrible. So I had these books to fall back on, and I distinctly remember the last summer that I spent before I moved here, I didn't have power for 2 weeks, and I was basically, we were stranded where we were. We couldn't get out because there were trees or whatever. And I did some great work because I was just cut off from the internet and I couldn't do endless scrolling on Tumblr, even though I do love Tumblr as a resource. Just looking at what I had around me, I use my Kindle for some of it, but that still counts, the book. But just having these resources that are, like old books, books that I had when I was a kid, like I had a Mercer Mayer book that I was like, oh, these creatures are really cool, or I had like Shel Silverstein drawings, or just these things that I wouldn't expect would be any kind of inspiration to me, and because I have these physical copies. If you have means to have books, I think it's in your best interest.
Absolutely. And also libraries are a great thing. There's one book on accurate Egyptian fashion, and it was published in 1991. It immediately went out of print, but god damn it, the Seattle Library has one of those copies. And I just went and Xeroxed the whole thing, probably posted it to the internet at some point, but it's amazing how some of those resources are just locked away. and so being able to get access to them off of the internet is pretty cool.
Or have a network of friends that have a Xerox of the
Xerox of
there's your shit
there you
that I
go.
can use.
Yeah, it's pretty great.
Also important, if you have a world that is super rich, make sure not to over-narrate. Do not expose your audience to it through just talking at them, because that is one of the most boring ways you can introduce your world to someone.
It's not wrong,
It's
but
just boring.
it's a certain style, and you can drive away a lot of otherwise
Yeah.
interested.
No, it's show versus tell.
Yeah.
It's always more interesting to show someone.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to tell them for some whatever kind of
Right,
reason.
right. But you can pick and choose. Like, tell them when it's not clear, when it's not going to be obvious why something is or why whatever happened. You know, find a way to inform them in ways that they otherwise wouldn't learn. But definitely let your world do the talking.
Yeah, when you have that first sentence of a novel that introduces someone to like 18 new words that are just in the context of your world, it's like, okay, slow it down a notch, give people that hook of recognizability that draws them into the world. Like, do it slowly, don't try to shove it all to them in a huge wall.
A good example on Lexxy's of this is, just had this conversation, was I was talking about Star Wars, like I like to do. And, you know, when they're teaching Luke about the Force, they're just straight up telling you, like, this is the Force, like, this is a thing, we're gonna talk about it a lot, it's important. But then other times you'll be in scenes and you'll see, like, a giant creature in the back, like a bantha, whatever. And, like, you're still having a moment where you're thinking, oh, but that's a really cool thing in the world. Not as cool as the Force, it's still something that's informing you, and it's just showing you, it's showing you this is a full experience, it is a full through.
It's a really good look into the natural environment that part of the story takes place in, the kind of people that live there, what the purpose of it is. You can tell by looking at the accessories and accoutrements that are on it, which, you know, all this overlapping stuff that we've been talking about comes together in that single element in the background that looks really freaking cool and helps with the immersion of your world and tells you a story without telling you anything. Words.
Like, I love with episode 4 that it respects you enough as a viewer to treat you as if you were just hanging out in Mos Eisley, instead of being like, oh my god, it's a dugong, and just like focusing on it. It's like, no, they're just a couple in a stable over there. You have bird legs just walk by. And then with the updated versions where there's only like crazy stuff is happening everywhere, it actually makes it less plausible and less cohesive. Like, it's so nice to just put those anchors there in the background to just encourage people
that
to
you can
see
think
the
about.
complexity. Yeah.
It's one of my favorite things is because I like to watch Netflix constantly, just constantly.
Like you do.
Like you do. Is taking something that I liked and not really thinking about why I liked it, just putting it on and then looking in the background, trying to actively focus on not the protagonist. Obviously, you'll say something like, but just really helpful for your personal repertoire.
Do you have examples?
Okay, here's an example. Have you guys watched the Lego movie? It was really amazing. If you go through and you look at it, you'll see things in the background and you'll actually see that they are stickers and you'll see the creases in the stickers. And when I went through and thought about that, I thought, wow, I've been putting things on the walls of my artwork or whatever, and I wasn't really thinking about like how they got there, like who put the posters up, what kind of event this poster was for, and like how it would have gotten there. Like probably everything isn't going to be taped up, it's going to have like wheat paste, and then I find myself looking at these Lego stickers and I pause it and I go, well, now I'm just going to look up how you put posters up on the street, and they're informing my work, but something that you wouldn't think. It's
Right,
Lego.
it would just be like, okay, I gotta put a poster up, so I'm gonna draw this square, and it's gonna be flat, and it's gonna have some artwork on it, and maybe there'll be a shadow laying across it so you know that it's 2D in a 2D world.
Yeah,
Things like that.
specificity is so important.
Giving it little crinkles and imperfections that you wouldn't otherwise think of.
It's now time for our Q&A. If you have, way to go, guys, we did it. Questions?
Because we
line
will
up
keep
with the
talking.
microphone.
We will keep talking.
So, this is good.
We have a microphone for anyone who's interested.
Oh, wait.
We can hear you.
We can repeat your question afterwards.
You gotta eat tonight.
It's not over yet, guys. There might be some nuggets of information.
But you're not hurting our feelings if you gotta leave.
Yeah. if
Thank
anyone
you so
needs
much
to
for
know-
listening.
Hurting my feelings. Speak for yourself, like.
Just
I'm just gonna talk loud. So anyways, I'm just curious, when you guys are building worlds, what's like your first thing you start with, your inspiration? Is it like your story, the people, the environment? Where do you guys like to start with your world?
It depends on what actually kind of sparks that in you. For my story, The Last Halloween, it was kind of like I stuck 4 stories together that I kind of had floating around based off dreams or a school project where I had to like make a noir novel, and I was like, all right, sure. But it can really come from doing research itself. You can see something and be like, wait, this has inspired me to want to do like a fantasy thing. Or you can design a monster that perhaps looks a little more fantastical and less monstrous, and you're like, well, I could put this into something else and then start building an entire world around that. Stick it together with something like middle school fantasies you used to have, and you're just like, well, there you go.
Whereas, like, my comic, The Cloud Factory, was inspired just by the basic idea of sort of an overland journey with a little bit of Howl's Moving Castle influence in it, where it's like, you know, what if there was some cool, inexplicable weather happening, and you had to go through all these trials and tribulations to figure out what was causing it, and that turned into the premise for a children's story, which turned into the premise for a short novel, which turned into the premise for a graphic novel, which turned into the premise for a web comic series.
These things can go through so many permutations.
Yeah, and it went from having a single character to like a character with a sidekick, and then 2 separate characters, and then I developed a completely new story to go with that second character so that they would have equal importance within the story, and it went from there.
You are so decisive.
I definitely agree with that, where it's, you don't necessarily, the inspiration doesn't come from the same place each time, and you don't necessarily get to decide where it comes from. It's very much, I feel like it's that core concept. Like, I can see that being a huge core to your story and what drives your characters. And sometimes it's a narrative core, sometimes it's a stylistic core. You just know that there's a particular type of animal that you want to base an entire culture around, things like that. But it's just something that should be integral and unique to that world. That's enough where you can start to just hook other things into it. And sometimes even the thing that starts you off, you end up shifting off of it, and that's completely fine. Like, it's a very fluid process.
Yeah, or they turn into 2 separate stories, where it's like, well, I still like this original idea, but I came up with this new one though, and that's pretty sweet. So
Also,
now you got 2.
It's good to kind of play to your strengths sometimes. It can kind of put you in a rut, so don't do it too often. But if you find that you despise drawing robots, and you have like this robot steampunk story you want to do, maybe put that one off for a little while.
Or work with somebody that is really good at it.
Yeah.
I would say definitely think about what are you world building for? Are you world building for something that is professional and you don't have a choice in what you're doing? Or, and you know, it's not a choice, but you know, you want to give you a choice. Or are you doing a project just on the side? I would say always start with something that makes you passionate, especially if it's a project that you're not excited about and you have to find a way to get excited about it. Like, always start from a point of passion.
Absolutely. Like, I have so many games at Microsoft. It's Microsoft, you know, what are you going to do? So many games that I didn't want to work on. And it was just finding that nugget of something where you could just twist something and make it interesting to you and make their idea better as a result of it. And so, yeah, passion is a good one.
Thank you.
Claire said something about being able to market your ability to world build. Now, you all come from a background of being able to show your world building through your art. If you don't come from that sort of background and it's mostly through fiction or prose or whatever, how do you market that world building ability?
You can still put that online as well. You can be like, this is a story about this, serialize it so that it doesn't take up all of your time constantly, even though it will anyway. And just, I think that's pretty important.
And having, like, you could have your story, but also have supplemental design documents. You could have things organized into categories, you know, things that inform attire, things that inform cuisine, things that inform, you know, the horticulture, things like that. Just in the same way that a concept artist might have like a page for plant drawings and a page for these. You know, you can have these supplemental documents that are, you know, broken into categories, and you can mix in academic study with your long-form prose.
Yeah, I think, because you mentioned that you were a fan of the Silmarillion as well. Like, there is a definite appeal to being able to just read into other people's design process if it's beautifully arranged, presented well. And of course, you can always, if you want that visual punch that draws people in, you can always collaborate with artists. Like, I know we are always champing at the bit to see cool things to illustrate. Like, the moment I'm done with a good book, I always want to put it down and start drawing the characters and worlds, and so.
And I know that can be difficult because a lot of the times when you're coming out as a writer, you don't really have the budget for that. And we understand that very well as well on our end. But you don't need to have a fully rendered, exquisitely painted piece to get your idea across. You can get some sketch work done. You can get a bunch of concepts, and they can cycle through pages of just rough drawing, and that kind of thing carries a lot of weight. So you don't have to go hardcore. Find someone whose work really expresses visual ideas that you have yourself, and kind of let them go with it. But don't feel like you have to lay down, thousands of dollars to get some visual aids. Even a couple things, just a couple style guides.
If you're looking for someone that's, I know I was not very confident as a writer and as a world builder for a while, and so I would go online and I would look for people that were about at my level, about at my place in their career, but on the writing side of it, and I would just look for people to work together and like have some portfolio stuff. There's like, not everybody's portfolio is made up of stuff that like actually got worked on. Like, sometimes it's student projects, sometimes it's like a passion project that didn't get released. Like, unless you're going for something that says you must have 5 ship titles, then you have some urban work.
Just often a lie, anyway.
Just lie. No. Just world build yourself.
Oh, by the way, if we don't get to your questions, we will, at least I will be out in the hallway answering more questions if you need help. Anyway, next question.
Thank you.
Just checking in, it's not over yet.
Yeah, no, we're good.
Hi. I'm asking one question for a friend who's too shy to come up. Real quick, you made a reference about the question everything. And you mentioned a term that was medieval something.
Oh,
Medieval POC.
POC.
Yeah, people of color. And it's just a blog full of paintings and sculptures and all kinds of things that feature like anyone who is a person of color to show that they've been there the whole time.
That's actually really cool.
Yeah.
Also, as a writer, I've got to ask, what are some of the differences you find between writing like an actual fictional, story that is going to get published as a book, and writing for an actual game? And what would be some good steps to make the transition between the two?
You guys?
Well, I just started working in the video game industry.
I think with the game,
Mostly Claire.
it has to be like you have to think about the player and how it's going to be played and how that will inform the world. Sometimes you have to have a much bigger picture of what the world's going to be, because you aren't just going to have it in the background. It might be something that the player's going to have to interact with. Anyway, I never worked on a game, so.
I will say that with writing for games, like, well, if you're writing a novel, it's a given that the person is invested in narrative and following a story. Like, that's why you read novels. But with games, it's a bit of a crapshoot as to whether or not people are in it for the story, because they are an innately interactive medium. And so I think your writing has to work on a lot of different levels, making sure that it's still pleasant if it's just background, like set dressing that people are quickly experiencing and skipping through cinematics, like making sure it still reads well in that context, but also giving that depth and subtlety that those of us who are really into the story in games can really dig into and follow into. And of course you also have branching narratives in games, which is pretty difficult, so understanding how to design plausible dialogue within that. Like, so much of the writing for games is dialogue.
Yeah. And again, it's a situation where you focus in on what's important for the purpose. If you're writing a novel, you may be focusing more on character interaction and character relationships, or an overarching plot, with regards to socio-political activity, things like that. That's the focus of that. Whereas in a game, you need to focus on things that you can interact with. Okay, there's a puzzle in this room. What do they have to interact with to get to that puzzle? Or they have to talk to this person to get this quest, to get that item, to get to that person. So you focus in on the most important things, and then branch out from there. Let your development kind of feather away from there, and you can focus a little bit more on the things surrounding those objects, and then a little bit less around there, and then the least in the background stuff that is the primary focus of the game.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
The topic of working professionally on world building was brought up quite a few times. How would you go about finding somebody who's looking for you to design for what they've already wrote or written and kind of designed, and they're looking for somebody to do the artwork for it?
That guy who just asked a question.
There are a lot of different venues for that. There are forums, even sub-forums within overarching communities. Like, I know a lot of my peers, a lot of my professional peers, because I posted on the Penny Arcade Artist Corner for years. Like,
So awesome.
like 10 years.
I love it.
And that's, you know, that's an environment where you just kind of grow up with people or interact with people on a day-to-day basis, and you might find somebody that's like that. There are also sites that are very specific where they have a place for you to post part of a project, like I am a writer seeking an artist, or I'm an artist seeking a writer. And there are different places on Reddit, on forums that are related to other things, not necessarily specific to creating X, Y, or Z. So, you know, find a community that you feel really comfortable with, and that may be populated by people that you'd like to work with and people whose passions are similar to yours. And I think you'll find it easier to find somebody to collaborate with in that respect. So.
If you were talking about, also if you were thinking about freelance, you know, definitely if you're getting into it, start there. If you're thinking about doing freelance, there are plenty of freelancer job boards. If you feel like you have the skills to pay the bills now, I would definitely look into that. And once you have some projects under your belt, you feel like you're ready to, if you want to, go into a more like structured professional setting, like our friend Claire has. You know, that would be the time where you're, you know, building a professional portfolio, and you have professional references, and you have other
posting on places like Behance and
right. That's definitely the arc that moves my career.
Yeah.
Going wherever. That where you start very immediately. Like, I posted on Gaia Online, and that's how I became a freelancer, was because I took jobs from the forum on Gaia Online. So.
Yeah. Avatar sketches. Signatures.
Yeah.
That's how you learn to use Photoshop.
It is so true. It's the weirdest venues where you meet people. It amazes me how some of like my best professional friends are. It's like my buddy Lissa and I were on the Lion King fan art archive back in the day. Now she's a story artist for a Disney feature. It's just the weirdest places where you meet people and make those connections. And then, you know, sometimes you know someone who knows a ton of writers, and suddenly they can make that connection. It's very serendipitous.
Find other passionate people.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Hi. So you mentioned taking inspiration from like animals and cultures and making your own. So probably there's a lot of people who see something like the example you gave, Avatar with all the bioluminescence, or another story or movie or something that had a really cool feature or something in the culture that gave them inspiration for something. How would you approach that and like making it your own, but without risking like taking it away or just legal stuff? Like how would you suggest approaching that?
So first off, I'd suggest that if you see something in something that, for anyone, you should really look up what copy law and appropriation laws are, because it is very weird. It is very not well nailed down in this country.
It's a big gray area on purpose.
Well, you should look up the history of Mickey Mouse, and then maybe you'll have a better idea about what copy laws are like there. But, I would say that you know, be informed about that. But then going beyond that is look at whatever you're looking at. Like, I really love the crop top jackets they put guys in Final Fantasy. But what I did is I realized I like that because of the silhouette it gave these people, and so I went and I looked at, you know, what I liked about that and found other examples of that, and just found maybe where that inspiration was coming from. Most of the time finding it was things in human culture. But just finding whatever that flavor is and putting it into what you want. Not necessarily, you know, word for word or whatever, but getting that essence and making it your own.
And my recommendation there is, once you've found that point of inspiration and started assimilating it into your work, once you feel like you've comfortably absorbed that, put it away for a little while. Work on it without that. kind of looming over you. Don't constantly refer to it, otherwise it will continue to inform your work, perhaps more thoroughly than you'd like. So keeping some distance away from your references once you've had some practice, once you've done some sketching and you've developed it a little while, work on it for a while without it. See what you come up with. See what variations on that style you can create. And then maybe check back later, like, okay, here's mine, here's that. All right, we're good. This doesn't look like anything like this anymore, but it still carries that little taste of inspiration, that flavor of inspiration that I liked from the original source.
I can't second what both of you said, but specifically the idea of finding the inspiration that person was looking at. Like essentially the inspirational etymology, like just going backwards and finding like what are the bioluminescent creatures that they were looking at and drawing from that instead. And it kind of cuts them out of the equation and gives you the chance to get a new inspiration and a sort of new perspective on it. And the way you were saying, like, it just stops you from staring at Avatar because you want to be Avatar, or staring at the things you like because you want to mimic them. Keeps it fresh.
Cool. Thank you.
Do we have time for one more, or are we off?
He said time.
Okay, we said time, but if you guys want to chat with some of us, I know I'm going to hang out here for a second, and Abby will be here for a second.
Thanks for coming, guys.
Yeah, thank you
We'll be
guys.
out in the hallway. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of PAX!